The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in March of 1876, and by Thursday afternoon, Daisy Foster stood alone on the dusty platform of White River, South Dakota, wearing the same black mourning dress she had worn to her father's funeral back in Missouri. She clutched a carpetbag that held everything she owned in this world, staring at the ramshackle buildings that made up the town and wondering how she would survive the month, let alone make a life here. Her father's death had left her with nothing but debts and the name of a distant uncle who lived somewhere in these Dakota territories, though 3 days of searching had revealed that Uncle Warren had moved on to the gold fields 2 years prior, and nobody expected to see him again. The wind carried the smell of livestock and leather through the streets, and Daisy pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders despite the afternoon sun. She had 47 cents to her name and nowhere to sleep that night. The boarding house mistress had made it clear that charity extended only to those who could pay, and the sympathetic looks from the townspeople had not translated into offers of employment. A woman alone, without skills or connections, was an inconvenience in a place where survival demanded hard work and practical knowledge. She walked down the main street with her head high, though her stomach twisted with fear. The general store, the saloon, the blacksmith shop, all seemed closed to her. She had asked at each establishment, and the answers were always the same. No work for a city woman who could not cook for crowds, sew leather, or handle the rough labor that frontier life required. At the edge of town, she noticed a low building with hides stretched on wooden frames in the yard. The smell that came from the place was pungent and unpleasant, but smoke rose from a chimney, and she could hear the sound of someone working inside. A sign hung crookedly above the door reading, "Thompson's Tannery and Leather Goods." She had passed it twice already, dismissing it because surely such work was not meant for women, but desperation had a way of changing what seemed possible. Daisy approached the open door and peered inside. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight, and it took her eyes a moment to adjust. She saw barrels and vats, wooden tools hanging on walls, and stacks of hides in various states of processing. A man stood with his back to her, working at a large hide stretched across a frame. His sleeves were rolled up past his elbows, and his movements were methodical and sure. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sounding smaller than she intended. The man turned, and she found herself looking at someone perhaps 5 or 6 years older than her own 22 years. He had dark hair that needed cutting, a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, and eyes the color of storm clouds. His expression was one of surprise rather than annoyance. "Help you, miss?" he asked, wiping his hands on a leather apron that had seen considerable use. "My name is Daisy Foster," she said, stepping inside though he had not invited her. "I'm looking for work. Any kind of work. I can learn whatever needs learning." He studied her for a long moment, taking in her morning dress and city shoes, the carpetbag she still carried, and the determined set of her jaw that fought against the desperation in her eyes. "This is a tannery," he said finally. "The work is hard, and the smell does not wash out easy. Most women would not consider it." "I am not most women," Daisy said, though her voice wavered slightly. "I am alone in this town with no prospects and no family. I need to make a living, and I am willing to do what it takes." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes. "Trevor Thompson," he said, introducing himself with a slight nod. "My father started this business 20 years back. He died last winter, and I have been running it alone since. The work has been piling up." "Then you need help," Daisy said quickly. "I may not know the trade, but I can follow instructions. I'm not afraid of hard work or unpleasant smells." Trevor walked closer, and she caught the scent of wood smoke and tanning chemicals that clung to him. "You understand what tanning is? It is not just making leather pretty. It is scraping flesh from hides, soaking them in solutions that burn your hands if you are not careful, working with brains and oils and bark. It takes weeks to tan a hide properly, and every step matters." "Then teach me," Daisy said, meeting his eyes directly. "I have nowhere else to go and nothing else to lose. If you give me a chance, I will prove I can do this." He was quiet for a long moment, and she held her breath, aware that this might be her only opportunity. Finally, Trevor said, "I cannot pay much to start. Room and board, and a small wage once you prove you can handle the work. There's a loft above the workshop where my father used to store supplies. It is not fancy, but it is dry and warm. Relief flooded through her so powerfully that her knees felt weak. "Thank you," she managed. "You will not regret this." "We will see about that," Trevor said, but there was something almost kind in his tone. "The work starts tomorrow at dawn. For now, let me show you where you will be staying, and then you should get some rest. The first days will be the hardest." He led her up a narrow staircase at the back of the building, to a loft space that smelled of dried leather and dust. There was a cot in one corner, a small table with a basin, and a trunk that looked like it had not been opened in years. A single window looked out over the grasslands beyond the town. "It is not much," Trevor said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "It is everything," Daisy said honestly, setting down her carpet bag. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson." "Trevor," he corrected. "If we are going to be working together, might as well use given names." "Trevor," she repeated, and then added, "I'm Daisy." He nodded and started down the stairs, then paused and looked back up at her. "Why White River? You said you were looking for family." "My uncle was supposed to be here," Daisy explained, "but he moved on. I used the last of my money for the train ticket west. I thought I would have somewhere to go when I arrived." "Life has a way of changing plans," Trevor said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he knew about disappointment himself. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we start with the basics." That night, lying on the narrow cot and listening to the wind whistle around the building, Daisy allowed herself to cry quietly into the thin pillow. She thought of her father, of the life she had known in Missouri, of how frightened she had been standing on that platform. But she also thought about the kindness in Trevor Thompson's eyes when he could have turned her away, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, she could build something here in this rough town at the edge of the territories. Dawn came early, announced by roosters and the sound of Trevor moving around downstairs. Daisy washed her face in cold water from the basin, braided her dark hair tightly, and changed from her morning dress into the only other dress she owned, a simple brown calico that had been practical for housework back home. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the table and barely recognized the pale, anxious woman staring back. When she came down the stairs, Trevor already had a fire going in the stove and coffee brewing. He looked up from the ledger he was reading and gestured to a cup on the table. "You will need that," he said, "and probably more before the day is done." The coffee was strong and bitter, but Daisy drank it gratefully. Trevor set aside his ledger and stood, moving to the center of the workshop where morning light streamed through the open door. "Tanning is about transformation," he began, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher. "We take a raw hide that would rot and stiffen, and we turn it into something useful that will last for years. There are many ways to tan leather, but here we use a combination of methods depending on what the customer needs." He walked to where several fresh hides were stacked, and Daisy tried not to show her revulsion at the sight. They still had bits of flesh clinging to them, and the smell was overwhelming. "First step is fleshing," Trevor said, dragging one of the hides to a wooden beam that stood at an angle in the center of the room. He draped the hide over it, flesh side up, and selected a curved blade from the wall. "This is a fleshing knife. You have to remove all the fat and tissue from the hide, or it will rot during the tanning process. Watch." He began to work, his movements smooth and practiced. The blade scraped across the hide in long strokes, removing tissue in thin strips. You have to use enough pressure to clean it properly, but not so much that you cut through the hide itself. That takes practice and feel. Daisy watched closely, noting the angle of the blade, the way he braced the hide with his other hand, the rhythm of his work. After several minutes, Trevor stepped back and gestured to the hide. "Your turn," he said, offering her the blade. Her first attempts were clumsy. The knife slipped, or she pressed too lightly and accomplished nothing, or she pressed too hard and Trevor gently corrected her before she could damage the hide. Her hands were not used to gripping the tool so firmly, and within an hour her palms were aching. "Keep your wrist steady," Trevor said, standing behind her and reaching around to adjust her grip. His hands were rough and warm, and Daisy found herself acutely aware of his presence. "Let the blade do the work. You are guiding it, not forcing it." She tried again, and this time the blade moved more smoothly. A strip of tissue peeled away, and Trevor said, "Good, like that." They worked through the morning, Trevor coaching her through the fleshing of 3 hides. By noon, Daisy's arms trembled with exhaustion, Her dress was spotted with unpleasant things she tried not to think about, and her hands were raw. But she had also successfully fleshed an entire hide under Trevor's watchful eye, and the sense of accomplishment was unlike anything she had felt in months. Trevor noticed her struggling and said, "That's enough for today. Your hands need to toughen up, or you will have blisters you cannot work through. Come on, let me show you how to clean up properly." He led her to a pump outside, where she scrubbed her hands and arms with harsh soap that smelled of lye. The water was cold, but it felt good against her overheated skin. "You did better than I expected," Trevor said as he worked the pump handle for her. "Most people give up after the first hour." "I told you I was not afraid of hard work," Daisy said, though in truth she was sore, in places she had not known could get sore. "There is a difference between not being afraid and actually doing it," Trevor replied. "You did it. That counts for something." They ate a simple lunch of bread and cheese that Trevor had brought from the boarding house. He explained that he took most of his meals there, as he was no great cook, but that Daisy was welcome to use the stove in the workshop if she preferred to prepare her own food. "I can cook," Daisy said. "If you do not mind sharing supplies, I could make meals for both of us, better than cheese and bread every day." Trevor looked surprised, then thoughtful. "That seems fair. I will provide the food, you do the cooking. That works." In the afternoon, he showed her the next steps of the process. The fleshed hides went into wooden barrels filled with water and lime, where they would soak for days to loosen the hair. After that came more scraping to remove every bit of hair and the top layer of skin. Then, the hides would be washed repeatedly to remove all the lime before the actual tanning could begin. "Brain tanning is the old way," Trevor explained, showing her a jar of prepared solution that did indeed contain animal brains mixed with water. "The Dakota people who live in these territories taught my father the method. It makes soft, supple leather that is good for clothing and moccasins. But for saddles and boots and belts, we use oak bark tanning. That takes longer but makes stronger leather." He showed her the pit where hides soaked in a solution of water and ground oak bark, some of them suspended for weeks to slowly absorb the tannins. The chemistry is complex, but what you need to know is that the tannins bind with the proteins in the hide and change its structure. It stops being skin that will rot and becomes leather that will last. Daisy listened intently, trying to memorize everything. The process was far more complicated than she had imagined, requiring knowledge of timing, chemistry, and the feel of the leather itself. Trevor spoke with a passion about his craft that made her see it not as mere work, but as something almost like art. Over the following days, they fell into a rhythm. Daisy rose at dawn and prepared breakfast while Trevor tended the fire and checked the hides in their various stages of processing. She learned to judge when a hide had soaked long enough in the lime, how to stretch and stake out a skin for drying, how to work oil into brain-tanned leather until it was soft as cloth. Her hands developed calluses and her arms grew stronger. The smell that had made her stomach turn on the first day became something she barely noticed. Trevor was a patient teacher, explaining each step carefully and correcting her mistakes without making her feel foolish. He had a quiet way about him, not given to unnecessary talk, but when he did speak, it was usually worth hearing. Daisy learned that he had been working with his father since he was 12 years old, that his mother had died when he was young, and that he had once considered leaving White River to seek his fortune in the gold fields, but had stayed when his father's health began to fail. "Do you regret it?" Daisy asked one morning as they worked side by side, scraping hair from soaked hides. "Staying, I mean, when you could have gone looking for gold." Trevor was quiet for a moment, his blade moving steadily across the hide. "I used to," he admitted, "especially right after Pa died. Felt like I'd given up my life to run a business that barely makes enough to survive. But gold fever makes fools of men. Most who go find nothing but hardship and disappointment. At least here I have a trade I know, and honest work." "It is good work," Daisy said, "creating something useful from what would otherwise be wasted. There is honor in that." He glanced at her and something warm flickered in his gray eyes. "Never thought of it that way, but I suppose you are right." As weeks passed, Daisy began to handle more of the work independently. She could flesh a hide without supervision now, manage the lime vats, and prepare the tanning solutions according to Trevor's specifications. She learned to recognize the subtle differences in leather quality, which hides would make good saddle leather and which were better suited for gloves or boots. Word spread through White River that Trevor Thompson had taken on an apprentice, and the novelty of a woman working in a tannery brought a few curious visitors. Some were skeptical, others made jokes that Trevor politely shut down, but a few were genuinely impressed when they saw the quality of work Daisy was producing. One afternoon in late May, a rancher named Samuel Burke came to pick up a custom saddle that Trevor had been working on for months. The saddle was beautiful, with intricate tooling and leather dyed a deep mahogany. Samuel examined it carefully, testing the stirrups and running his hands over the seat. "Fine work, Thompson," he said approvingly. "Best saddle I have ever owned." "Thank you," Trevor said. "But Daisy did much of the preparation work on that leather. She has a good hand for the finishing process." Samuel looked at Daisy with new interest. "That right? Well, I will be damned. You've got yourself a good apprentice there, Trevor." After Samuel left, substantially lighter in coin but happy with his purchase, Trevor split the profit with Daisy. She stared at the money in her hand more than she had ever earned in her life and felt tears prick at her eyes. "This is too much," she protested. "I'm still learning." "You earned it," Trevor said firmly. "You did good work. That saddle would not have been ready on time without your help, and it would not have been as fine. You deserve your share." That evening, Daisy used some of her earnings to buy ingredients for a proper supper. She made chicken stew with dumplings, using the small stove in the workshop, and the smell that filled the building was a welcome change from the usual tannery odors. When she called Trevor to eat, he looked at the spread on the small table with something like wonder. "Been a long time since I had a meal like this," he said. "Not since before Ma died." They ate together as the sun set outside, and for the first time since coming to White River, Daisy felt something other than fear or determination. She felt content, maybe even happy. She looked across the table at Trevor, at his strong hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, at the way his hair fell across his forehead, at the slight smile on his lips as he savored the food, and realized with a start that she'd been noticing these things about him for weeks now. The realization unsettled her. She had not come here looking for romance. She had come looking for survival. Trevor had given her that, taught her a trade, treated her with respect and kindness when the world had offered her nothing. She could not repay that by developing feelings that would complicate everything. But feelings, she was learning, did not much care about logic. Trevor looked up and caught her watching him. "Something wrong?" he asked. "No," Daisy said quickly, looking down at her bowl. "Nothing wrong." But that night in her loft, she lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the workshop below and admitted to herself that something had shifted. Trevor was no longer just the man who had given her a chance. He was the person she most looked forward to seeing each morning, whose rare smiles made her heart beat faster, whose praise meant more than any amount of money. She thought about the way he had adjusted her grip on the fleshing knife that first day, standing close behind her, his breath warm against her ear. The way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not paying attention, as if he was trying to figure out a puzzle. The way they had developed an easy rhythm of working together, anticipating each other's needs, moving around the workshop like dancers who knew their steps by heart. Summer came to the Dakota territories with blazing heat and afternoon thunderstorms that rolled across the grasslands. The work in the tannery became harder in the heat, and Trevor and Daisy began starting earlier in the morning and extending their midday break to avoid the worst of it. One particularly hot afternoon, Trevor suggested they take a walk to the creek that ran a half-mile from town. "The hides are all soaking or drying," he said. "Nothing that needs tending for a few hours. You have been working hard, and even leather workers deserve an afternoon off." They walked through the tall grass, and Daisy lifted her face to catch the breeze. She had bought a new dress with her earnings, a light blue cotton that was practical, but prettier than anything she had owned in months. She had told herself it was just because her old dresses were worn out, but she knew she had chosen it, hoping Trevor would notice. He had noticed. She had caught the look in his eyes that morning when she came down the stairs, though he had said nothing. The creek was shallow but clear, running over smooth stones. Cottonwood trees grew along its banks, providing blessed shade. Trevor sat on a fallen log and pulled off his boots, rolling up his trouser legs and wading into the water with a contented sigh. "Come on," he called to Daisy. "It is too hot for propriety." She hesitated only a moment before removing her own shoes and stockings and joining him. The water was shockingly cold against her overheated skin, and she gasped and laughed at the same time. Trevor grinned at her, and it transformed his usually serious face into something younger and lighter. "When I was a boy, I spent half my summers in this creek," he said. "Pa used to get so mad because I would disappear when there was work to be done. But even he had to admit that a body needs some relief from the heat." "I can see why you loved it," Daisy said, lifting her skirt slightly to wade deeper. "It feels like heaven." They stayed there for over an hour, talking about things that had nothing to do with leather or work. Trevor told her about growing up in White River, about the year the Dakota camp had been nearby, and he had made friends with a boy his age who taught him to fish with his hands. Daisy told him about her childhood in Missouri, about her mother who died when she was 15, about her father's slow decline after his business failed. "He was a good man," she said softly. "But he made bad investments, trusted the wrong people. By the end, he was broken by it. Sometimes I think he died as much from shame as from the sickness." Trevor was quiet for a moment, then said, "My pa was a hard man. Fair, but hard. Never gave much in the way of affection or kind words, but he taught me everything he knew about tanning, and when he was dying, he told me he was proud of the man I had become. That meant more than all the hugs and praise other boys got from their fathers." "He should have told you sooner," Daisy said. "Probably," Trevor agreed, "but at least he told me it all. Some never hear it." When they finally walked back to town, their feet still bare and their boots slung over their shoulders, Daisy felt lighter than she had in years. The burden of fear and uncertainty that she had carried since her father's death had eased, replaced by something warmer and more complicated. As they approached the tannery, Trevor said suddenly, "I'm glad you came to White River, Daisy. Glad you walked into my shop that day." "So am I," she said, and meant it with her whole heart. The summer months were good for business. Ranchers needed repairs done on their tack, and Trevor taught Daisy how to stitch leather with the heavy needles and waxed thread, how to rivet, and how to tool decorative patterns. Her hands became more skilled, her eye for quality sharper. Trevor began trusting her with tasks he once would have kept for himself, and Daisy felt a pride in her work that she had never experienced before. But alongside the satisfaction of mastering her trade, the feelings she had tried to ignore grew stronger. She found herself watching Trevor when he worked, admiring the strength in his shoulders as he stretched a hide, the concentration on his face when he did delicate tooling, the gentleness in his hands when he examined a piece of leather for flaws. She thought she caught him watching her too sometimes, a look that lasted a moment too long, a smile that seemed to have layers of meaning. But Trevor never said anything, never crossed the invisible line between employer and employee, teacher and student, and Daisy did not know how to bridge that gap without risking everything she had built here. In August, a traveling merchant came through White River and stopped at the tannery. He was an older man with shrewd eyes and an assessing manner, and he examined the leather goods on display with the air of someone who knew quality when he saw it. "This is excellent work," he said, holding up a pair of gloves that Daisy had finished just that morning. "Who made these?" "I did," Daisy said, wiping her hands on her apron. The merchant looked at her with surprise, then approval. "You have real skill, young lady. I travel a circuit through the territories, selling goods in towns that do not have craftsmen of their own. I would be interested in purchasing items from you, if you can produce enough quantity." Trevor stepped forward. "What kind of quantity are we talking about?" They negotiated for half an hour, and by the end of it, they had an agreement. The merchant would return every 2 months and purchase whatever gloves, belts, and small leather goods they could produce beyond their local orders. The prices he offered were fair, and the opportunity to expand their business beyond White River was exciting. After the merchant left, Trevor turned to Daisy with undisguised delight. "Do you know what this means? We can hire someone to help with the basic labor. Let us focus on the skilled work. We can expand the workshop, maybe even buy better tools. This could change everything." His excitement was contagious, and Daisy found herself laughing. "We did it," she said. "We really did it." Trevor grabbed her hands, caught up in the moment. "You did it," he corrected. "Those gloves were what convinced him. Your work, Daisy." They stood there, hands clasped, smiling at each other, and the moment stretched and shifted into something else. Trevor's smile faded, replaced by a look of such intensity that Daisy's breath caught. He was still holding her hands, and she could feel the warmth of his palms against hers, the calluses that matched her own. "Daisy," he said, and her name sounded different in his voice, softer and deeper at the same time. "Yes," she whispered. He seemed to struggle with himself, then said in a rush, "These past months working with you, teaching you, watching you become so skilled and confident, it has been the best time I can remember. You are not just my apprentice anymore, or just someone I work with. You are more than that, much more. And I know it is not proper for me to say so, and I am probably a fool for risking what we have built, but I cannot keep pretending I do not feel this way." Daisy's heart was hammering so hard she could barely hear her own voice. "What way?" "I think I am falling in love with you," Trevor said, and the words hung in the air between them, fragile and enormous. "I might already be in love with you. And if you do not feel the same, then we will never speak of it again, and nothing has to change. But I had to tell you. I had to at least say it once." For a moment, Daisy could not find words. Relief and joy and disbelief all crashed over her at once. Then she stepped closer, still holding his hands, and said, "You are not a fool. Or if you are, then so am I, because I've been feeling the same way for months now. I was just too afraid to say anything." The smile that broke across Trevor's face was like sunrise. "Really?" "Really," Daisy confirmed, and then she was laughing and maybe crying a little at the same time. "I love you, Trevor Thompson. I have loved you since you showed me how to hold a fleshing knife and did not laugh at my terrible first attempts. Maybe even since the day you gave me a chance when no one else in this town would." Trevor pulled her into his arms, and Daisy wrapped hers around his waist, pressing her face against his chest. She could hear his heart beating fast, matching her own. He smelled like wood smoke and leather and sunshine, and she thought she could stay in this moment forever and be happy. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the middle of the tannery, surrounded by the evidence of their shared work and the life they had been building without quite realizing it. When Trevor finally pulled back enough to look at her face, his eyes were shining. "I want to do this properly," he said. "Court you the right way. Take you to dinner, walk with you on Sundays, let the whole town know I'm trying to win your heart." "You already have my heart," Daisy said, "but I would love all of that anyway." That evening, they walked through White River together, and if people noticed that they were holding hands or that both of them looked happier than anyone had seen them before, nobody said anything unkind. By morning, the news would be all over town that Trevor Thompson and his apprentice were courting, but in that moment, Daisy did not care what anyone thought. She was happy, truly happy, for the first time since before her father got sick. The following months were full of work and courtship and joy. Trevor did court her properly, bringing her flowers from the prairie, taking her to the church socials, sitting with her on the boarding house porch in the evenings when the work was done. They continued working together in the tannery, but now there was no pretending that they were merely business partners or friends. The love between them was as obvious as the sunrise, and just as impossible to ignore. They hired a young man named Peter to help with the heavy labor, which freed both of them to focus on the skilled work that the traveling merchant wanted. The business grew steadily, and with it, their confidence in a shared future. Trevor had a small house on the edge of town that had belonged to his father, and on a cool evening in October, he took Daisy there and showed her around the 3 rooms that needed work but had good bones. "I want to fix it up," he said, standing in the empty main room. "Make it into a real home. I was thinking we could add a better kitchen, maybe build on another room or 2 when we need them. But I did not want to do any of it without asking you first." Daisy looked at him, at the hope and nervousness in his expression, and knew what he was trying to ask. "Trevor," she said gently. He took a breath and reached for her hand. "I know we have only been courting a few months, even though we have known each other longer, and I know this is not some fancy proposal with a ring and speeches. But Daisy Foster, I love you more than I thought I could love anyone. You are my partner in work and in life, and I cannot imagine my future without you in it. Will you marry me? Will you help me make this house into our home?" Daisy felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you. I would be honored to marry you." Trevor kissed her then, tender and sweet, and Daisy thought about the frightened woman who had stepped off the train in White River 7 months ago, desperate and alone. She could never have imagined that she would find not just survival, but love, not just work, but purpose, not just shelter, but a home. They were married in December, on a cold, clear day when the prairie was dusted with snow. The ceremony was held in the small church, with half the town in attendance. Daisy wore a dress of cream-colored wool that she had made herself, and Trevor wore his best suit and looked more nervous than she had ever seen him. When he slipped a simple gold band on her finger and promised to love and honor her all his days, Daisy felt a happiness so complete it was almost frightening. The reception was held at the boarding house with food and music and dancing that lasted well into the evening. Samuel Burke toasted them and said he had never seen two people better suited for each other, which made Daisy blush and Trevor grin. The traveling merchant, who had returned just in time for the wedding, gave them a beautiful saddle blanket as a gift and said he looked forward to doing business with them for many years to come. As the party wound down, Trevor and Daisy walked through the snowy streets to their home, the house that Trevor had been working on for weeks. He had indeed added a better kitchen, and he had built furniture, and he had made sure the roof was tight and the chimney drew well. A fire was already burning in the hearth, lit earlier by one of their friends, and the main room glowed with warmth. "Welcome home, Mrs. Thompson," Trevor said, lifting her over the threshold and making her laugh. "It feels like a dream," Daisy said, looking around at the home they would share. "Sometimes I still cannot believe this is real." "It is real," Trevor assured her, setting her down and cupping her face in his hands. "You are real, and I am real, and this life we are building together is as real as anything I have ever known. I love you, Daisy." "I love you too," she whispered, and kissed him. Their first winter as a married couple was cold but cozy. They worked in the tannery during the day, with Peter handling much of the routine labor, while Trevor and Daisy focused on the custom orders that were becoming their specialty. Word had spread about the quality of their work, and people came from towns 2 days' ride away to commission saddles, boots, and gun belts. In the evenings, they returned to their home, and Daisy cooked while Trevor worked on furniture or repairs. They talked about everything and nothing, made plans for the spring, dreamed about the future. Sometimes they read aloud to each other from the books Daisy had brought from Missouri or the newspapers that came through on the stage. Sometimes they just sat by the fire, comfortable in the silence that came from truly knowing another person. When spring arrived, bringing green grass and wildflowers to the prairie, Daisy realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had wanted to be sure before saying anything. When she told Trevor over breakfast one morning, watching his face carefully for his reaction, he went very still. "A baby?" he said. "We are going to have a baby?" "Yes," Daisy said. "Sometime in the autumn, I think." "Are you happy?" Trevor stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped over, and then he was pulling her into his arms, holding her tight. "Happy?" he said against her hair. "I'm terrified and thrilled and more happy than I knew was possible. We are going to have a baby." They prepared through the summer, even as they worked to fill their orders and keep the business running. Trevor built a cradle with his own hands, carving it from pine and finishing it until it was smooth as silk. Daisy sewed tiny clothes and blankets, marveling at how small everything was. They argued good-naturedly about names, each suggesting options that the other vetoed for various reasons. In October, on a day when the autumn leaves were turning gold and red across the prairie, Daisy went into labor. The town midwife, a capable woman named Harriet, came to help, and Trevor paced outside the bedroom door trying not to panic. It was a long labor, lasting through the afternoon and into the evening, and by the time Harriet finally emerged to tell Trevor he had a son, he was nearly beside himself with worry. "She is tired but fine," Harriet said firmly, "and you have a healthy baby boy. Go meet your son." Trevor went into the bedroom and found Daisy propped up against pillows, looking exhausted but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she had made. She looked up at Trevor and smiled. "Come meet Thomas," she said softly. Trevor approached carefully, as if he might break something just by walking too hard. He looked down at his son, at the tiny red face and the small fist that had worked free of the blanket, and felt something shift in his chest. This was his child, his and Daisy's, a whole new person who had not existed before, who would depend on them for everything. "Thomas," he said, trying out the name. "Thomas Thompson. That is a strong name." "I thought you would like it," Daisy said, "since it starts with T like yours." Trevor sat carefully on the edge of the bed and reached out to touch his son's hand, the tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb with surprising strength. "He is perfect," Trevor whispered. "You are perfect. Thank you, Daisy. Thank you for this." Being parents changed their lives in ways both exhausting and wonderful. Thomas was a healthy baby with a powerful set of lungs, and those first months were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feedings and learning to do everything one-handed while holding an infant. But there were also the quiet moments when Trevor came home to find Daisy nursing the baby by the fire, or when Thomas finally fell asleep on his father's chest, and Trevor was afraid to move for fear of waking him. They adjusted their work schedule to accommodate the baby. Daisy brought Thomas to the tannery in a basket and worked while he slept, and Trevor took turns watching him when she needed to do tasks that required both hands. Peter, who had become a trusted friend as well as an employee, was surprisingly good with the baby and volunteered to watch him sometimes so Daisy and Trevor could focus on complex projects. As Thomas grew from an infant into a toddler, he became a fixture in the tannery, playing with scraps of leather and watching his parents work with solemn eyes. Daisy taught him to stack the small pieces, making a game of it, while Trevor carved him toys from leftover wood. The business continued to thrive. The traveling merchant was true to his word, returning regularly and always leaving with a substantial order. They had saved enough money to expand the tannery again, adding a proper storefront where they could display finished goods and meet with customers. Daisy handled much of the business side now, keeping the books and managing orders, while Trevor focused on the specialized tanning and tooling that was his real talent. When Thomas was 2 years old, Daisy found herself pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, as if her body remembered what to do. In the summer of 1880, she gave birth to a daughter they named Dorothy. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's dark hair, and from the beginning, she was a calmer baby than her brother had been. Trevor was utterly smitten with his daughter, and watching him hold her with such tenderness made Daisy fall in love with him all over again. He sang to Dorothy in the evenings, old songs his mother had taught him, and carried her around the house pointing out everything and naming it as if she could understand. Their home was full now, full of noise and love and the chaos that came with small children. But it was also full of joy, the kind that came from building something together, from choosing each other every day, from creating a life that was richer and more meaningful than either of them could have imagined. On a warm evening in late summer, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Daisy and Trevor sat on the porch and watched the sun set over the prairie. Trevor had his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned against him, perfectly content. "Do you ever think about that day you walked into my tannery?" Trevor asked. "How scared you looked." "I was terrified," Daisy admitted. "I thought I was going to end up sleeping in the street or working in the saloon. I had no idea what I was going to do." "I almost turned you away," Trevor said. "I remember thinking that a city woman would never last a day doing tannery work. I am so glad I was wrong." "So am I," Daisy said. She turned to look at him, at the face she knew as well as her own now, and said, "You saved my life that day, Trevor. You gave me a chance when I had nothing. I will never forget that." "You saved mine too," Trevor said. "I just did not know it needed saving. I was so lonely, going through the motions of work and life, but not really living. You changed everything. You made me want to build something, to plan for the future, to be better than I was. I love you, Daisy. More now than the day we married, if that is possible." "It is possible," Daisy said, kissing him softly, "because I feel the same way." The years continued to unfold, bringing their share of challenges and triumphs. There were hard winters and dry summers, years when business was lean and they had to be careful with every penny. Thomas grew into a thoughtful boy who loved working with his hands like his father, while Dorothy was quick and curious, always asking questions and figuring out how things worked. When Thomas was 8 and Dorothy was 6, they had another child, a son they named Timothy, who had his mother's smile and a disposition so cheerful it was impossible not to love him. 3 children kept them busy, but Daisy had learned to balance motherhood with her work in the tannery. She was faster now than she had been in those first fumbling days, her skills honed by years of practice, and she took pride in being able to teach her own children the trade that had saved her life. The tannery had become one of the most successful businesses in White River, known throughout the Dakota territories for quality work. Trevor and Daisy had trained 2 more apprentices over the years, both young people who needed a chance just as Daisy once had. She never forgot what it felt like to be desperate and alone, and she made sure to offer opportunities to others when she could. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Trevor surprised Daisy by closing the tannery for the day and taking her on a picnic to the creek where they had waited that first summer. It was early June, and the prairie was green and full of flowers. They left the children with Harriet, who had become a good friend over the years, and rode out in the wagon. At the creek, Trevor spread a blanket under the same cottonwood trees where they had talked all those years ago. He had packed a basket with food and even managed to find a bottle of wine, and they ate and drank and remembered. "I was thinking about that traveling merchant," Trevor said, "the one who gave us our first big opportunity. He retired last year, did you hear?" "I did," Daisy said. "I hope he is enjoying his rest. He was good to us." "He told me once that the secret to success was recognizing talent when you saw it," Trevor said. "I did not think I had that ability, but then you walked into my shop. I almost missed it, Daisy. I almost let you walk away. That terrifies me when I think about it." "But you did not," Daisy said, reaching for his hand. "You took a chance on a desperate woman in morning clothes who knew nothing about tanning. You taught me everything, and you loved me, and you built this life with me. That is what matters." "Still," Trevor said, "I like to think it was fate that brought you to White River, that you were meant to find my tannery, and I was meant to be there that day, and everything that has happened since was supposed to happen. Maybe it was." "Darn," Daisy said. "Or maybe it was just luck and choices and taking chances when they appeared. Either way, I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful for you." They talked about the future, about their dreams for their children and for the business. Thomas was already showing real aptitude for leather work, though Trevor was careful not to push him if he wanted to choose a different path. Dorothy talked about becoming a teacher, inspired by the schoolmarm who had recently arrived in White River, and Timothy was still too young to know what he wanted, content to be everyone's favorite and to make them laugh with his antics. "Whatever they choose, we will support them," Daisy said. "That is what parents do." "That is what good parents do," Trevor corrected. "We are trying to be good parents." "I think we are succeeding," Daisy said, and kissed him. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, they packed up their picnic and prepared to head home. But before they climbed into the wagon, Trevor pulled Daisy close and said, "Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for marrying me and for giving me this beautiful life. I love you more than words can say." "I love you too," Daisy said, "always." The years continued to pass, bringing changes to White River and to their family. The railroad expanded, bringing more people to the territories. The tannery had to compete with cheaper goods shipped from back east, but their reputation for quality kept them busy with customers who appreciated craftsmanship. Thomas took over more and more of the daily operations as he grew into a young man, showing a business sense that complemented his skill with leather. Dorothy did indeed become a teacher, starting at the White River School when she was just 18, and Timothy surprised everyone by developing a passion for ranching, eventually going to work for Samuel Burke. Trevor's hair turned gray at the temples, and Daisy found lines around her eyes that had not been there before, but they were both healthy and happy. The house that Trevor had renovated so carefully when they were newlyweds had been expanded twice, and it was filled with memories and laughter. On a spring morning in 1895, nearly 20 years after Daisy had first arrived in White River, she stood in the tannery and watched Thomas teach a new apprentice the proper way to flesh a hide. The girl was young and scared, much as Daisy had been, and Thomas was patient and encouraging, much as Trevor had been with Daisy. Trevor came to stand beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. They were both still working, though they had eased back on the long hours as Thomas took on more responsibility. "She reminds me of you," Trevor said, nodding toward the apprentice. "That same determination to prove herself." "Everyone deserves a chance," Daisy said. "We both know that." "We do," Trevor agreed. That evening, their entire family gathered for Sunday dinner, a tradition they had maintained for years. Thomas and his new wife, Sarah, were there with their infant son. Dorothy came with her husband, a gentleman who worked at the bank. Timothy rode in from the Burke Ranch, full of stories about cattle drives and horses. The house was loud and chaotic and wonderful. After dinner, when the dishes were cleared and the younger generation had taken the baby outside to enjoy the warm evening, Trevor and Daisy sat together on the porch, much as they had done for years. "We have built something good here," Trevor said, looking out at the prairie that stretched to the horizon. "Not just the business, but the family, the life. It is more than I ever dreamed of." "It is more than either of us dreamed of," Daisy said. "When I think about that terrified girl who stepped off the train with 47 cents and no prospects, I can barely recognize her. She had no idea what was waiting for her here." "You saved yourself," Trevor said. "You walked into my tannery and asked for a chance, and then you worked harder than anyone I have ever known to prove you could do it. I just taught you the skills. You provided the courage and the determination." "We saved each other," Daisy corrected. "You were lonely and grieving, and I was desperate and afraid. We found each other at exactly the right moment, and we built this together. That is the truth of it." Trevor pulled her closer and kissed the top of her head. "I love you, Daisy Thompson. I have loved you from the moment you told me you were not afraid of hard work, and I will love you until my last breath." "And I love you," Daisy said, "for taking a chance on me, for teaching me a trade, for building this life with me, for everything." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set over the Dakota prairie, the land that had challenged them and rewarded them and given them a home. Inside the house, they could hear their children and grandchild, the next generation that carried their legacy forward. The tannery stood solid and prosperous, a testament to years of hard work and dedication. And here on the porch, Trevor and Daisy held each other, two people who had found love in the most unexpected of places and built something lasting from desperation and hope. The years ahead would bring more grandchildren, more challenges, more joys and sorrows, as all lives do. Thomas would expand the business even further, eventually opening a second location in a nearby town. Dorothy would become the head teacher at the White River School, shaping young minds for decades. Timothy would save enough to buy his own small ranch, fulfilling a dream he had nurtured since childhood. And through it all, Trevor and Daisy would be there, the foundation upon which their family was built, still working side by side in the tannery when their health allowed, still deeply in love after all the years. When Trevor was 70 years old and Daisy was 68, they finally sold the tannery to Thomas, confident that their legacy was in good hands. They spent their retirement traveling to visit all their children and the growing number of grandchildren, and working in the garden Trevor planted behind their house, and sitting on the porch in the evenings watching the prairie that had been their home for so long. One evening, as they sat together wrapped in a shared blanket against the cool autumn air, Daisy said, "I never thanked you properly, you know." "For what?" Trevor asked, his voice rougher now with age but still warm. "For that first day," Daisy said, "for looking at a desperate woman in mourning clothes and seeing not a burden but a possibility, for teaching me a trade that gave me independence and pride, for loving me when I did not think anyone would ever love me again, for building this beautiful life with me." Trevor was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "You have thanked me every day just by being who you are. Every morning I woke up next to you. Every evening we worked side by side, every moment with our children and grandchildren. That was thanks enough. You gave my life meaning, Daisy. You made me happier than I ever thought I could be. If anything, I should be thanking you." "Then we are both grateful," Daisy said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "And we are both blessed." "Yes," Trevor agreed, "we are." They sat together as the stars came out one by one over the prairie, two people who had found each other when they both needed it most, who had built a life and a love that lasted, who had faced every challenge together and come through stronger. The tannery that had brought them together was now in the hands of the next generation, but its legacy lived on not just in the leather goods that bore the Thompson name, but in the family that had grown from that first act of kindness when Trevor Thompson gave a desperate woman named Daisy Foster a chance to learn a trade and make a living alone. And in doing so, he had given them both something far more valuable than survival. He had given them love, partnership, purpose, and a life richer than either of them could have imagined on that spring day in 1876, when Daisy walked into his tannery with nothing but determination and hope. Years later, when their children and grandchildren gathered to celebrate Trevor and Daisy's 50th wedding anniversary, the stories were told again about how they met, about the woman who learned tanning to survive and the cowboy who spent hours teaching her the trade, never knowing that he was also teaching her how to live again, how to hope again, how to love again. The younger generations listened with wide eyes, marveling at the romance of it all, at the courage it took for Daisy to ask for help and for Trevor to offer it, at the love that grew between them as naturally as grass on the prairie. Thomas stood up to give a toast. His own children gathered around him. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who taught us that love is not just a feeling but a choice you make every day, a partnership built on respect and hard work and unwavering support, who showed us that the greatest gifts are often chances taken on people who just need someone to believe in them. To Trevor and Daisy Thompson, who built not just a successful business, but a family legacy that will continue for generations." Everyone raised their glasses and drank, and Trevor and Daisy, now in their 70s and still sitting side by side as they always had, looked at each other with eyes that held a lifetime of shared memories and love that had only deepened with time. 50 years, Daisy said softly, for Trevor's ears alone. "Can you believe it?" "Every moment," Trevor said, taking her hand. "I remember every single day, and I would not change one of them." "Not even the hard times?" Daisy asked. "Especially not the hard times," Trevor said. "They made us who we are. They made this what it is." And Daisy smiled, knowing he was right, knowing that their love story was not perfect or simple, but it was theirs, built from desperation and kindness, from leather and determination, from a chance taken on a spring day in 1876 that changed two lives forever. As the celebration continued around them, with music and dancing and the sound of family filling the air, Trevor and Daisy sat together, their hands clasped, their hearts full, grateful for every day they had been given together and for every day still to come. The wild Dakota prairie stretched out beyond the town, unchanged in its essential nature, even as the world around it had transformed, and in that permanence there was comfort and peace. They had started with nothing but need and opportunity, and they had built everything that mattered. A trade, a business, a home, a family, a love that lasted through decades and would echo forward through generations. And it had all begun with a woman who needed to learn tanning to make a living alone, and a cowboy who spent hours teaching her the trade, never knowing that in teaching her to survive, he would also teach her to love again, and that she would teach him the same. That was their story, told and retold through the years, a testament to the power of compassion and courage and the kind of love that is built slowly through shared work and quiet moments, and the choice to keep choosing each other, day after day, year after year, until the choosing becomes as natural as breathing. And when Trevor Thompson and Daisy Foster Thompson were finally laid to rest in the White River Cemetery, side by side as they had been in life, their legacy lived on in the tannery that bore their name, in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their lessons forward, and in the story of how two lonely people found each other in a tannery on the Dakota prairie and built a love that would last forever.